Lightning tore across the sky as a small boy ran through the trees, his shoes soaked through, his breath coming in short, frightened gasps. Branches scratched at his arms. Thunder rolled so close that the ground seemed to shake beneath his feet. He did not look back. He could not stop. Behind him, somewhere in the dark, a woman's harsh voice still echoed in his ears, and he had only one thought in his small mind. He had to get away. The boy's name was Julian, and he was 7 years old. He had slipped out of the nursery window when his nanny fell asleep in her chair, tired from another long evening of scolding him for things he barely understood. He had wanted only to find a quiet place, away from her sharp words and colder silences. But the storm had come faster than he expected, and now the narrow path he knew from daylight looked like a stranger's maze. He stumbled over a root and fell hard onto wet leaves. For a moment he lay there, too frightened to move, rain soaking through his coat. Somewhere close by, he could hear the rush of water, louder than it should have been. The river had risen with the storm, and the bank was closer than he realized. He pushed himself up on shaking arms and took a step forward, trying to find his way back toward the lights of the great house in the distance. But his foot slipped on the muddy slope, and before he could catch himself, he was sliding down toward the swollen river, his small hands grabbing uselessly at wet grass. He might have gone into the water if not for the voice that suddenly broke through the storm. "Hold on, grab my hand." A young woman came running down the slope, her skirts heavy with rain, her hair plastered to her face. She threw herself down at the very edge of the bank and stretched out her arm just as Julian's fingers lost their last grip on the grass. Her hand closed around his wrist with surprising strength, and she pulled him back from the water with a force that left them both gasping on the muddy ground. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain kept falling and the thunder kept rolling, but Julian was safe, held tightly in the arms of a stranger who did not even know his name. "You are all right," the woman said, her voice steady despite the storm. "You are all right now, I have you." Julian could not stop shaking. He buried his face against her shoulder and began to cry, all the fear of the night pouring out of him at once. The woman did not ask him questions. She did not scold him for wandering out in a storm, the way his nanny surely would have. She simply held him close and rocked him gently, the way someone might comfort a child who belonged to them. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she lived in a small cottage near the edge of the woods, not far from the grand estate that rose beyond the trees. She had been walking home from the village when the storm broke, and she had heard the boys cry over the sound of the wind. She had not thought twice before running toward it. When Julian's tears finally slowed, Clara helped him to his feet and looked him over carefully in the dim light. His clothes were fine, far finer than anything a village child would wear, but soaked and torn from his fall. His shoes were the kind polished by servants each morning. Clara noticed these things, but she did not dwell on them. In that moment, he was not a rich boy or a poor boy. He was simply a frightened child who needed someone to be kind to him. "What is your name?" she asked gently, crouching down so her eyes were level with his. "Julian," he whispered, wiping his face with a muddy sleeve. "Well, Julian, I think we should get you somewhere warm and dry before this storm decides to swallow us both." She took off her own shawl, damp as it was, and wrapped it around his shoulders anyway, because it was better than nothing. Then she took his small, cold hand in hers and began to lead him back through the trees, choosing a path she knew well even in the darkness. As they walked, Julian began to talk, the way children often do once fear loosens its grip. He told her in broken pieces that he had run away from his nanny, that his house was big and cold and quiet, that his mother had died a long time ago, and his father was always busy and far away, even when he was in the very next room. Clara listened to every word without interrupting, her heart aching a little more with each small confession. "My father does not have time for stories," Julian said, his voice small. "He does not have time for anything, not since Mother went to heaven." Clara felt a pang of sympathy she could not quite explain, not just for the boy beside her, but for the father he described, a man so buried in his own grief that he could not see the loneliness growing in his own son. She said nothing about this. Instead, she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should have someone else to tell your stories to. I happen to be very good at listening." Julian looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes, as though she had offered him something more precious than anything he owned. "Really, you would listen to my stories?" "Every single one," Clara promised. They walked until the trees began to thin, and the great house came into view, its windows glowing with warm light against the darkness of the storm. Julian slowed his steps, and Clara felt his hand tighten in hers. "They will be angry," he whispered. "They will be very angry that I left." "Then let us make sure they know you are safe first," Clara said. "Anger fades faster when fear is gone." As they approached the edge of the garden wall, a sudden commotion broke out near the house. Servants with lanterns spilled out into the rain, calling Julian's name in voices sharp with worry. A woman in a nanny's uniform came rushing forward, her face pale, and swept Julian up into her arms with more relief than anger, at least in that first moment. Clara stepped back into the shadows of the trees, suddenly aware of how strange she must look, a village woman soaked to the bone, standing at the edge of a duke's estate in the middle of a storm. She had heard of the family who lived here, of course, the way everyone in the village had. They spoke of a great house full of sadness, of a master who was rarely seen and rarely smiled. She had never imagined she would find herself standing at its gates, with the master's son held safe in her own arms only moments before. "Wait," Julian called out suddenly, twisting in the nanny's grip to look back at Clara. "Wait, please, I want to know her name." The nanny turned, startled, searching the darkness until her eyes found Clara standing at the edge of the trees. There was suspicion in her gaze, quick and sharp, the kind reserved for strangers near a great house. "I am Clara Whitmore," Clara said simply, stepping forward just enough to be seen clearly. "I live near the woods. I found the young master by the river. He is safe, but he was very frightened." The nanny's expression shifted slightly, softening just enough to offer a stiff nod of thanks, though her eyes remained wary. "The household is grateful," she said, in a tone that did not sound especially grateful at all. "We will take him inside now." "Wait," Julian said again, more urgently this time. He reached out toward Clara, his small hand grasping at the air. "Will I see you again? Please say yes." Clara hesitated only a moment before answering, her heart moved by the desperate hope in his voice. "If you would like to see me again, you may find me near the old stone bridge by the river most afternoons. I often walk there." The nanny's frown deepened, but before she could say anything, one of the older servants stepped forward, urging them all inside out of the rain. Julian was carried away toward the warm lights of the house, but he kept his eyes on Clara until the door closed behind him, as though afraid she might vanish the moment he looked away. Clara stood alone in the rain for a long moment, watching the great house swallow the boy she had just pulled from danger. She did not know his family. She did not know the weight of the name he carried, or the crest that marked the carriages waiting silently near the stables, hidden behind the curtain of rain. To her, he was simply a lonely child who needed kindness, and she had given it freely, without thought of reward. She turned and began the walk back to her cottage, her clothes heavy with rain, her mind full of the boy's sad eyes and sadder words. She thought of the father he had described, a man too lost in his own grief to notice his son slipping quietly out of windows in the dark. She wondered briefly, what kind of man could let a child grow so lonely inside such a grand and beautiful house? She did not know, as she walked home beneath the last rumbles of the passing storm, that the boy she had comforted was the son of the Duke of Camden, one of the most powerful men in the region. She did not know that her chance meeting by the river was about to change the course of her life, and his, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. All she knew, in that quiet moment, was that a lonely little boy had asked to see her again, and something in her heart had already decided that she would go. The following afternoon, Clara found herself standing near the old stone bridge earlier than she had planned, telling herself she was only there for the fresh air, and not because a small boy's hopeful voice had followed her into her dreams the night before. The river ran calmer now that the storm had passed, its surface catching flashes of pale sunlight through the clouds. She waited, half expecting no one to come at all. But then she heard footsteps, quick and light, and Julian appeared from the tree line, his face breaking into the widest smile she had seen on him yet. He was dressed neatly now, his fine clothes clean and pressed, but his eyes held the same eager loneliness she remembered from the night before. "You came," he said, breathless, as though he could hardly believe it. "I promised I would," Clara said, smiling as she knelt down to his level. "Did you get in a great deal of trouble last night?" Julian shrugged, a gesture too old and too tired for a boy his age. "My nanny scolded me for a long time. My father did not say anything at all. He was in his study when they told him I was found. He only nodded and went back to his papers." Clara felt that same ache in her chest again, the one that had followed her home the night before. She did not know how to explain to a 7-year-old why a grieving father might struggle to show his love, so instead she simply reached out and touched his shoulder gently. "Well," she said, "I am very glad you are safe, and since you are here now, perhaps you would like to hear a story." Julian's eyes lit up, and he settled down onto a smooth rock near the bridge, tucking his knees up to his chest in eager anticipation. Clara told him a story about a brave fox who outwitted a clever wolf using nothing but patience and wit, and Julian listened with such rapt attention that he forgot for a little while that he was a lonely boy in a cold house. This became their secret ritual. Nearly every afternoon, when his tutors allowed him a short break, or when his nanny was occupied elsewhere, Julian would slip away to the old stone bridge to find Clara waiting. Sometimes she brought him small treats from the village bakery. Sometimes they simply sat together and watched the water move beneath the bridge, saying nothing at all, content in each other's quiet company. Clara never asked about his family's wealth or his father's title. She never seemed impressed or intimidated by the fine clothes he wore or the way his shoes never seemed to gather a single speck of dust. She treated him exactly as she would treat any lonely child who crossed her path, with warmth, patience, and an endless supply of stories. And Julian, in turn, began to change in small but unmistakable ways. He laughed more. He hummed little tunes under his breath as he walked through the halls of his home. He stopped flinching every time a door opened, no longer certain it would bring another scolding. The servants noticed first, exchanging quiet glances whenever the young master smiled without being coaxed into it. Word of the change eventually reached the one person who noticed everything in that house, even when he seemed to notice nothing at all. Adrian Ashworth, the Duke of Camden, had spent the 2 years since his wife's passing building a wall around himself, so thick that even his own son could not seem to break through it. He rose early, worked through mountains of estate business, and retired late, filling every waking hour with duty so there would be no room left for grief. He loved his son deeply and truly, but grief had taught him to fear loving anything too openly, as though love itself might be the thing that broke him completely. It was his housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, who first mentioned it to him, quite by accident, while discussing the household accounts one evening. "The young master has seemed much happier lately, Your Grace," she said, almost as an afterthought. "He has taken to slipping away to the river most afternoons. I believe he has made a friend in the village." Adrian looked up from his papers, genuinely surprised. "A friend? Julian has never mentioned any friend." "He calls her Miss Clara, Your Grace, a young woman who lives near the woods. I am told she found him during the storm 2 nights ago when he wandered off in the dark." Adrian set down his pen slowly, a strange unease settling over him. He had been told, briefly, that Julian had been found safe after the storm, but he had been so consumed with estate matters that night that he had not thought to ask for details. Now, hearing that his son had been slipping away nearly every day to meet a stranger, he felt the first stirrings of both curiosity and concern. Has anyone confirmed who this woman is, what her intentions might be? She seems a simple village woman, Your Grace. No family of great means, but well regarded in the village for her kindness. I do not believe she means any harm. If anything, she seems to have done the young master a great deal of good. Adrian said nothing more that evening, but the thought stayed with him long after Mrs. Dalton left the room. He told himself his concern was only for Julian's safety, that any father would want to know who his son spent his afternoons with. But some quieter part of him wondered, with an ache he did not examine too closely, what kind of woman could bring such light back into his son's eyes when he himself had failed to do so. The next afternoon, without telling anyone his intentions, Adrian found an excuse to walk the eastern edge of his estate, the path that happened to lead toward the old stone bridge. He told himself he was simply inspecting the grounds, checking the state of the fences and the condition of the river path after the storm. He did not admit, even to himself, that he was hopping to catch a glimpse of the woman his son spoke of with such shining eyes. He found them before they saw him. Hidden behind a thick hedge at the top of the slope, he watched as Julian sat beside a young woman on the riverbank, both of them laughing at something she had just said. The sound of his son's laughter, so free and unguarded, struck Adrian with a force he was not prepared for. He could not remember the last time he had heard Julian laugh like that in his own presence. He watched as the woman gently tucked a loose strand of Julian's hair behind his ear, the gesture so natural and unforced that it looked as though she had done it 100 times before. He watched as Julian leaned into her side without hesitation, completely at ease, completely happy, in a way he never seemed to be within the walls of his own home. Adrian stood behind that hedge for nearly 20 minutes, unable to look away, something shifting slowly inside his chest with every passing moment. He had expected, perhaps, to find some scheming opportunist trying to worm her way into a wealthy family through his son's affections. Instead, he found genuine warmth, entirely unposed, entirely sincere, offered freely to a child who happened to be his, though she clearly did not know it. When Julian finally rose to head back toward the house, Adrian slipped away before he could be seen, his mind unusually full for the walk back to the estate. He thought of the woman's easy laughter, the careful way she had spoken to his son, the complete absence of flattery or calculation in her manner. He found himself wanting to know more about her, not merely as his son's mysterious friend, but as a person entirely her own. He could not simply approach her as the Duke of Camden. He knew well enough how quickly people's manners changed the moment they learned his title, how words became careful and smiles became practiced. He wanted to know if her kindness toward Julian was as genuine as it appeared, and there was only one way to be certain. He would need to meet her without revealing who he truly was. The idea took root over the following days, growing more solid each time he saw Julian's continued happiness, each small piece of evidence that this woman had done more for his son in a few short weeks than he had managed in 2 long years of grief and distance. He began asking careful questions among his staff, learning what he could about Clara Whitmore without drawing attention to his interest. She was, by all accounts, an honest woman of modest means, well liked in the village, known for her patience with children and her quiet, steady kindness. He decided, finally, that he would introduce himself as Adrian Ashworth, a family steward or distant relation managing matters on behalf of the household, someone connected enough to have reason to speak with her about Julian's well-being, but not so connected that his title would color everything she said to him. It was, he knew, a small deception, but he told himself it was a necessary one. He needed to see her as she truly was before he revealed who he truly was. He did not yet realize how deeply that small deception would come to matter, nor how much it would cost him before the truth finally came to light. He knew only that something in him, some part long buried beneath grief and duty, had been stirred awake by the sight of his son's unguarded laughter, and by the quiet stranger who had somehow given that laughter back to him. The following afternoon, Adrian made his way toward the old stone bridge, his heart beating with a nervous energy he had not felt in years, preparing to meet the woman who had already, without knowing it, begun to change the course of his carefully guarded life. Clara was sitting on the same smooth rock near the bridge, waiting for Julian as she always did, when she noticed a man approaching from the direction of the estate. He was tall, dressed simply but well, with the kind of quiet confidence that made her sit up a little straighter without quite knowing why. He stopped a respectful distance away and offered a small, polite bow. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," he said. "My name is Adrian Ashworth. I manage certain matters for the Camden household. I wonder if I might have a word with you regarding young Master Julian." Clara felt a flicker of worry cross her chest. Had she done something wrong? Had someone finally decided their afternoons together were improper or unwelcome? She rose to her feet, brushing off her skirts, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. "Of course, is something the matter? Julian has done nothing wrong if that is your concern. He is a good boy." "No, nothing is the matter," Adrian said quickly, something in her immediate protectiveness catching him off guard. Quite the opposite, in fact. The household has noticed a considerable change in him these past weeks, a change for the better. I was hoping to understand more about how that came to be. Clara relaxed slightly, though she remained cautious. "I only offered him kindness, sir. He seemed a lonely child who needed someone to listen to him. I did not think there was any harm in that." "There is no harm at all," Adrian said, and something in his voice, low and sincere, made Clara look at him more closely. "I think, perhaps, there has been a great deal of good in it." They fell into an easy conversation after that, walking slowly along the riverbank while they waited for Julian to arrive. Clara spoke freely, without the caution she might have used had she known she was speaking to the very man whose household employed her, or rather, whose household this man claimed only to manage. She told him about the stories she told Julian, about the little jokes that made him laugh, about how his eyes lit up whenever he learned something new. "He speaks of his father sometimes," Clara said carefully, unsure how much she should share with a stranger, even one who seemed to have Julian's best interests at heart. "He says his father is always busy, always distant. It breaks my heart a little, to be honest, sir. No child should feel so unseen in his own home." Adrian felt those words land like a blow, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Perhaps his father carries burdens the boy does not yet understand," he said quietly. "Perhaps," Clara agreed, though her tone held a note of gentle challenge. "But grief is not an excuse to abandon a living child, is it? I understand loss, sir. I lost my own parents when I was young, but even in my sorrow I never forgot to be kind to those who needed me. A father who cannot see his own son's loneliness is, I think, a very foolish man, however much he might be grieving." Adrian said nothing for a long moment, the words settling uncomfortably close to the truth he had been avoiding for 2 long years. He had told himself, over and over, that his distance was protection, both for himself and for Julian, that burying himself in duty was the only way to keep functioning at all. Hearing a stranger name it so plainly, without any knowledge of who she was truly speaking to, struck him harder than any accusation from his own staff ever could have. "You speak boldly of a man you have never met," he said finally, though there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of quiet wonder. "I speak of what I have seen in his son's eyes," Clara replied simply. "That is enough for me." Their conversation was interrupted by Julian's arrival, the boy running down the path with his usual eager energy, freezing in surprise when he saw the man standing beside Clara. "Father Steward," Julian said, tilting his head in confusion, "what are you doing here?" "I came to see how you were getting on, young master," Adrian said smoothly, careful to keep his voice even. "It seems you have found a very good friend." Julian's face broke into a wide grin and he ran to Clara's side, tugging on her hand. "The very best friend. She tells the most wonderful stories, Mr. Ashworth. You should hear them." Adrian found himself staying far longer than he had intended that afternoon, listening as Clara wove another tale for Julian, this one about a lost star finding its way home across a dark and endless sky. He watched his son's rapt attention, watched Clara's patient, warm expression as she told the story, and felt something inside him loosen just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long finally beginning to ease. From that day forward, Adrian began finding reasons to visit the bridge whenever Julian went to meet Clara. He told himself each time that he was simply looking after his son's well-being, ensuring the boy remained safe in the company of someone outside the household. But with each visit, he found himself lingering longer, speaking more freely, drawn in by Clara's quiet strength and unguarded honesty in a way that unsettled and comforted him in equal measure. Clara, for her part, found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit, even to herself. There was something in the steward's quiet manner, the careful way he listened, the rare but genuine warmth that broke through his composed exterior whenever Julian said something particularly clever, that drew her in despite her better judgment. She told herself it was only friendship, only the natural bond formed between two people who both cared for the same lonely little boy. But some nights, walking home after their meetings, she found her thoughts lingering on him far longer than friendship alone could explain. Not everyone in the Camden household was pleased by these developments. Lord Gerald Fenwick, a distant cousin of the late Duchess who had taken up long-term residence at Camden Hall under the guise of assisting with estate matters, watched the growing warmth between Julian and the mysterious village woman with sharp, calculating eyes. Fenwick had spent the past 2 years quietly positioning himself as an indispensable advisor to the grieving Duke, hoping that his influence over the estate's affairs, and perhaps eventually over Julian's upbringing, might grow into something far more valuable should misfortune ever befall the boy. A happy, secure Julian, bonded closely to both his father and a kind outside influence, was not part of Fenwick's careful plans. He began watching Clara from a distance, gathering information, waiting for an opportunity to remove what he saw as an inconvenient obstacle to his own ambitions. His chance came on an afternoon when Adrian was called away unexpectedly to attend to matters in the city, leaving Julian in the care of his usual staff for several days. Fenwick made his way to the old stone bridge alone, finding Clara waiting there as she always did, though Julian had not yet arrived. "Miss Whitmore," Fenwick said, his tone smooth but cold, "I believe it is time we had a conversation about your continued presence near this family." Clara straightened, sensing immediately that this man's intentions were far different from Adrian's had been. "I am not sure I understand your meaning, sir." "I mean," Fenwick said, stepping closer with deliberate slowness, "that a village woman of no particular standing has no business inserting herself so deeply into the life of a ducal heir. Whatever games you believe yourself to be playing, whatever hopes you may have of climbing above your station through the boy's affections, I suggest you abandon them now, before matters become unpleasant for you." Clara felt anger rise hot in her chest, though she kept her voice steady. "I have no games, sir. I have only offered a lonely child some kindness." "If that troubles you, I cannot imagine why." "It troubles me," Fenwick said, his eyes narrowing, "because lonely children with soft hearts are easily manipulated by clever women seeking advantage. I have seen it before. I will not allow it to happen here." "Then you have seen very little of me at all," Clara replied, refusing to back down despite the cold threat in his voice. "I want nothing from this family beyond Julian's happiness. If you cannot understand that, then the fault lies with you, not with me." Fenwick's expression darkened, and for a moment Clara feared she had pushed him too far. "Careful, Miss Whitmore. I have considerable influence in this household, far more than you realize. It would be a simple matter to have you barred from these grounds entirely, or worse, to see your reputation in the village thoroughly ruined. Consider this a friendly warning. Stay away from the boy or face the consequences." He turned and walked away before Clara could respond, leaving her standing alone by the bridge, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. She had done nothing wrong, and yet this man's threats felt dangerously real. She thought of Julian's hopeful eyes, of how devastated he would be if she simply vanished from his life without explanation, and she resolved not to let Fenwick's cruelty frighten her away so easily. When Julian arrived a short while later, he immediately noticed her troubled expression. "What is wrong, Miss Clara? You look upset." Clara forced a reassuring smile, unwilling to burden the boy with adult troubles he did not need to carry. "Nothing at all, dear one. I am simply tired today. Come, let us find a story to cheer us both up." But the encounter with Fenwick weighed on her mind for days afterward, a shadow hanging over what had once been simple, joyful afternoons. She considered more than once whether it might be wiser to quietly step back from Julian's life before real trouble found her. Yet every time she saw the boy's face light up at her arrival, every time he ran to greet her with unrestrained joy, she found she could not bring herself to abandon him, whatever the cost might be to herself. When Adrian returned from the city several days later, he sensed immediately that something had changed. Clara's easy warmth toward him remained, but there was a new wariness beneath it, a careful guardedness that had not been there before. It took several visits before he finally coaxed the truth from her, his expression growing darker with every word she spoke about Fenwick's threats. "He had no right to speak to you that way," Adrian said, his voice tight with an anger he rarely allowed himself to show. "I will see that this does not happen again." "You seem to have a great deal of influence for a mere steward," Clara observed, watching him carefully, something in his fierce protectiveness striking her as unusual for a man of his supposed station. "I have more influence than you might expect," Adrian said carefully, aware that he was walking dangerously close to a truth he had not yet found the courage to reveal. "I promise you, Miss Whitmore, that man will not trouble you again." True to his word, Adrian confronted Fenwick that very evening, his voice cold with barely restrained fury as he made clear, in no uncertain terms, that any further interference with Clara or with Julian's happiness would not be tolerated. Fenwick, sensing the depth of the Duke's anger, retreated with false apologies and carefully hidden resentment, bidding his time for a better opportunity to strike. Clara never learned the full details of how the threats against her had so suddenly stopped, only that the steward's quiet intervention seemed to have settled the matter entirely. Her trust in him deepened further, her guardedness melting away once more into the easy warmth that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. She found herself, more and more, looking forward to his visits not merely for Julian's sake, but for her own. Neither of them spoke openly of the feelings quietly taking root between them, both too cautious, too uncertain of the boundaries of their unusual arrangement to name what was growing so steadily in the quiet afternoons by the river. But something had shifted, unmistakably, in the weeks since that first meeting by the bridge, and neither Clara nor Adrian could pretend, in their private thoughts, that it was only Julian who had brought them together. Yet the deception at the heart of their growing bond remained, waiting quietly beneath the surface of every conversation, every shared smile, every stolen afternoon by the water. Adrian knew with growing unease that the longer he waited to reveal his true identity, the more painful that revelation would eventually be. But grief and fear had made him a cautious man, and cautious men, he would soon learn, often wait far too long before finally telling the truth. The truth found its way out on an ordinary afternoon, in the way most carefully hidden secrets eventually do, through a small and unguarded moment that no one had thought to prepare for. Clara had come to Camden Hall itself for the first time, invited by Julian to see his favorite room in the grand house, a request Adrian had reluctantly allowed after weeks of the boy's persistent pleading. She stood in the entrance hall, taking in the towering ceilings and the portraits lining the walls, feeling entirely out of place amid such grandeur. Julian tugged her eagerly toward the library, chattering happily about the books he wanted to show her, when an elderly servant passed them in the corridor and paused to offer a respectful bow. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," the servant said, addressing Adrian, who had followed a few steps behind. "I trust the young master is showing his guest a pleasant time." The words landed in the quiet corridor like a stone dropped into still water. Clara froze mid-step, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Your Grace." She turned slowly to look at Adrian, whose face had gone pale with the sudden, unwanted revelation. "Your Grace," she repeated slowly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "You are not a steward at all. You are the Duke." "Clara, let me explain," Adrian began, stepping toward her, but she backed away, her hands trembling at her sides. "You let me believe you were someone else," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. "For weeks, I spoke to you as though you were an ordinary man. I told you my honest thoughts about a father who neglected his own son, never knowing I was speaking directly to that very father. Did you find it amusing, Your Grace, watching a village woman speak so boldly, never knowing the truth?" "It was never amusing," Adrian said, his voice pleading now, all his careful composure crumbling away. "I only wanted to know you honestly, without my title standing between us. I was afraid that if you knew who I truly was, you would treat me differently, the way everyone else does." "So instead you deceived me," Clara said, tears gathering in her eyes despite her best efforts to hold them back. "You let me grow close to you, let me speak freely, let me care for you, all while hiding something so fundamental about who you are. That is not honesty, Your Grace. That is a lie dressed up in kind words." Julian, sensing the sudden tension between the two adults he cared for most, looked between them with growing distress. "Miss Clara, please do not be angry. Father did not mean any harm, I am sure of it." But Clara could not stay a moment longer in that grand, unfamiliar house, surrounded by portraits of a family she now realized she had never truly understood. She turned and walked quickly toward the door, ignoring Adrian's pleas for her to stay and listen, ignoring the desperate confusion in Julian's voice as he called after her. She did not stop until she reached her own small cottage, where she finally allowed the tears to fall freely, her heart aching with a betrayal she had not expected to feel so deeply. She had known, of course, that a duke and a village woman existed in entirely different worlds. She had never imagined those worlds might collide so painfully, nor that the collision would hurt quite this much. In the days that followed, Clara stopped visiting the old stone bridge. She told herself it was for the best, that whatever fragile connection had grown between herself and Julian's father had been built on a foundation of deception too unstable to trust. But she could not stop thinking of Julian, alone once more in that vast, quiet house, waiting each afternoon for a friend who no longer came. Julian, for his part, refused to accept her absence easily. He begged his father, day after day, to explain why Miss Clara had disappeared so suddenly, why she no longer waited for him by the river with her warm smile and endless stories. Adrian, burdened with guilt he did not know how to ease, found himself unable to give his son any answer that made sense to a child's simple, hopeful heart. "She will come back," Julian insisted again and again, though his voice grew less certain with each passing day. "She promised she would listen to all my stories. She would not simply leave without saying goodbye." Adrian watched his son's happiness slowly fade once more, the light that Clara had brought back into Julian's eyes dimming with every empty afternoon by the bridge. The guilt of it settled heavily on his shoulders, made heavier still by his own private grief at losing something he had not even fully allowed himself to name. He had grown to care for Clara Whitmore, not merely as his son's kind companion, but as a woman whose honesty and warmth had begun to thaw a heart he had thought permanently frozen by loss. Fenwick, watching these developments with quiet satisfaction, saw in Clara's absence an opportunity too valuable to ignore. With the household in disarray and the Duke visibly distracted by matters of the heart, Fenwick began quietly maneuvering to expand his own influence over young Julian's education and upbringing, subtly suggesting to Adrian that perhaps it was time for the boy to be sent away to a proper boarding school, far from the distractions and disappointments of his current circumstances. The boy grows too attached to unsuitable influences, Fenwick argued one evening, his tone carefully reasonable. A structured education, away from the estate, would serve him far better than these unpredictable emotional attachments to village women who appear and disappear as they please. Adrian, still reeling from his own guilt and confusion, found himself unable to muster a strong argument against the suggestion, though something in his gut resisted the idea of sending Julian away so soon after the boy had finally begun to heal. He asked for time to consider the matter, unaware that Fenwick was already quietly setting other plans into motion, arrangements that would make Julian's departure from Camden Hall far more difficult to reverse once they were finally revealed. Meanwhile, Clara struggled through her own quiet grief, torn between her genuine hurt at Adrian's deception and her deepening worry for Julian's well-being. She heard whispers in the village, carried by servants who occasionally passed through on errands, that the young master had grown quiet and withdrawn once more, that his laughter had faded as quickly as it had appeared. The news troubled her more than she cared to admit, gnawing at her resolve to stay away. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after she had last seen either Julian or his father, a soft knock sounded at her cottage door. She opened it to find Adrian standing there, no longer dressed in the simple clothes of a steward, but in the fine attire befitting his true station, though his expression remained as uncertain and hopeful as it had been during their very first meeting by the bridge. "I have no right to ask anything more of you," he said quietly before she could speak. "But I could not let another day pass without telling you the truth of my own heart, whatever the cost to my pride." Clara stood silently in the doorway, torn between the urge to close the door against further hurt and the undeniable pull she still felt toward the man standing before her, however complicated their history had become. "I am listening," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Adrian took a deep breath, choosing his words with the same careful honesty she had once demanded of him without knowing it. "I deceived you because I was afraid, Clara, afraid that if you knew I was the Duke, you would see only my title, not the man beneath it. I have spent 2 years hiding behind grief and duty, afraid to let anyone close enough to hurt me again the way losing my wife hurt me. But you broke through that wall without even trying, simply by being honest and kind, and unafraid to challenge me when I needed challenging most." "That does not erase the lie," Clara said, though her voice had softened slightly. "No," Adrian agreed, "it does not. And I do not ask you to forget it or even to forgive it immediately. I only ask that you know the truth now, fully and completely. I care for you, Clara Whitmore, not as my son's companion and not as a curiosity to be observed from behind a hedge, but as a woman whose honesty and warmth have given me back a piece of myself I thought I had lost forever alongside my wife. And more than that, my son needs you. He has been quietly breaking these past 2 weeks, waiting for you to return, and I am not certain how much longer he can bear the disappointment." Clara felt her resolve wavering, torn between the hurt still lingering in her heart and the undeniable ache she felt at the thought of Julian's continued suffering. "I need time," she said finally, "time to think and to trust again. I cannot simply pretend the deception did not happen, however sincere your feelings may be now." "I understand," Adrian said, though disappointment flickered briefly across his face. "Take whatever time you need. But please, whatever you decide about me, do not let Julian suffer for my mistakes. He loves you dearly, Clara. He does not deserve to lose you because of my own foolish fear." He left her standing in her doorway that evening, the weight of his words settling heavily in her heart long after his footsteps had faded into the darkness. She did not yet know what she would decide, but she knew, with growing certainty, that she could not simply abandon the lonely little boy who had first found his way into her heart on a stormy night by the river, however complicated his family's circumstances had since become. 3 days after Adrian's visit to her cottage, Clara received an urgent message carried by a breathless young stable boy who had run the entire distance from Camden Hall without stopping. His hands shook as he handed her a folded note, his young face pale with worry. "Please, miss," he said, gasping for breath. "The housekeeper sent me straight away. She said you must come at once. It concerns the young master." Clara's heart lurched with immediate fear. She unfolded the note with trembling fingers and read Mrs. Dalton's hurried handwriting, the words striking her with sudden, sharp alarm. Julian was missing again, but this time the circumstances were far more dangerous than a simple storm and a slippery riverbank. According to the note, Lord Fenwick had used Adrian's brief absence on estate business that morning to set a long-planned scheme into motion. He had arranged, through forged papers and false claims of the Duke's authorization, to have Julian collected by a private carriage and taken toward a distant boarding school many hours away, one known for its harsh discipline and its willingness to sever a child from all previous attachments in the name of proper education. Fenwick had calculated that by the time Adrian returned and discovered the deception, Julian would already be far beyond easy reach, and the resulting chaos might be enough to finally discredit Adrian's judgment and secure Fenwick's own growing control over the estate's affairs. But Julian, terrified and desperate, had managed to slip away from the carriage during a brief stop at a coaching inn along the main road, disappearing into the surrounding countryside before his escort even realized he was gone. No one knew exactly where he had run, only that he was alone, frightened, and many miles from the safety of home, with darkness fast approaching and Fenwick's men now searching frantically to recover him before the truth of the scheme could unravel completely. Clara did not hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and ran from her cottage toward Camden Hall as fast as her legs would carry her, her mind racing through every possible place a frightened 7-year-old boy might seek shelter. By the time she reached the estate, the courtyard was in chaos, servants rushing in every direction, horses being saddled for a wide search of the surrounding roads and fields. Adrian appeared in the doorway just as she arrived, his face a mask of barely controlled panic, having returned from his business trip only an hour earlier to find his household in complete disarray, and his son missing under circumstances that made his blood run cold with fury and fear in equal measure. "Clara," he said, relief and desperation mixing in his voice at the sight of her. "Thank goodness. You know him better than anyone. Where would he go? Where would he try to hide?" Clara's mind raced through every conversation she had ever shared with Julian, every story he had told her about the places that made him feel safe. And then, suddenly, she remembered something he had mentioned only once, in passing, weeks earlier, about a hollow tree deep in the woods near the old stone bridge. A secret hiding place he had discovered on his own, a place he had called his own private kingdom, where no one could scold him or send him anywhere he did not wish to go. "The woods," she said urgently. "Near the bridge. There is a hollow tree he mentioned once. If he is frightened and looking for somewhere familiar, somewhere that feels safe, I believe he would go there." Adrian did not waste a single moment questioning her. He called out orders to redirect the search parties toward the river path while he and Clara set off together at a run, cutting through the estate grounds toward the woods as quickly as the fatting daylight would allow. Neither of them spoke as they ran, every ounce of their attention focused on reaching Julian before darkness fell completely and made the search infinitely more dangerous. They reached the old stone bridge just as the last light of day began fading into deep twilight blue. Clara led the way further into the trees, following half-remembered directions from a conversation weeks old, praying she remembered correctly, praying they would find him safe. And then, through the gathering shadows, she spotted it, a large old oak with a hollow at its base, wide enough for a small boy to curl inside. "Julian," she called out, her voice breaking with hope and fear combined. "Julian, it is Clara. Are you there?" For a long, agonizing moment there was only silence. Then a small, trembling voice answered from within the hollow tree. "Miss Clara, is that really you?" Clara rushed forward and knelt beside the hollow, finding Julian curled inside, scratched and exhausted, tears streaking through the dirt on his face, but blessedly, wonderfully safe. She reached in and pulled him gently into her arms, holding him tightly as he sobbed with relief against her shoulder, the terror of the day finally breaking free in a flood of exhausted tears. "I did not want to go away to that school," Julian cried, his small hands clutching desperately at her shawl. "I did not want to leave Father, and I did not want to leave you. I was so afraid I would never see either of you again." "You are safe now," Clara whispered, rocking him gently the way she had that very first stormy night. "You are safe, and no one is going to take you anywhere you do not wish to go. I promise you that." Adrian dropped to his knees beside them, his composed exterior finally cracking completely as he wrapped his arms around both his son and the woman who had helped bring him home. "I am so sorry, Julian," he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I should never have let Fenwick have so much influence in this house. I should have seen his true intentions long before they nearly cost me everything that matters most." They remained huddled together beneath the old oak tree for several long minutes, the terror of the day slowly giving way to overwhelming relief, before finally beginning the walk back toward Camden Hall. Julian held securely between them, refusing to let go of either Clara's hand or his father's. The truth of Fenwick's scheme unraveled quickly once they returned to the estate. The forged papers were discovered among his belongings, along with correspondence revealing months of careful manipulation, designed to slowly erode Adrian's trust in his own judgment, while positioning Fenwick as an indispensable authority over the household's affairs. Faced with undeniable evidence of his deception, and the very real danger he had placed young Julian in through his reckless scheme, Fenwick had no choice but to accept his immediate removal from Camden Hall, his ambitions finally and completely exposed before the entire household. In the days that followed, as the estate slowly settled back into calm after the chaos of Julian's disappearance, Adrian sought out Clara once more, this time not with careful explanations or pleas for understanding, but simply with quiet, honest gratitude. "You saved him," he said, finding her in the garden one afternoon, watching Julian play happily nearby, seemingly none the worse for his frightening ordeal. "Not just from the woods tonight, but from the loneliness that had swallowed him whole before you ever came into his life. I do not know how to properly thank you for that." "You do not need to thank me," Clara said, though a small smile touched her lips. "I never did any of it for reward. I only wanted him to know that someone in this world saw him clearly and cared for him simply because of who he is." "And what of me?" Adrian asked quietly, stepping closer, his earlier composure giving way to something far more vulnerable. "Have I any hope of being seen clearly as well? Not as a duke, and not as a grieving man hiding behind duty, but simply as myself." Clara studied him for a long moment, considering the weeks of hurt and confusion that had passed since the truth of his identity had first come to light, weighing them against the undeniable warmth and honesty she had witnessed in him since, the fierce protectiveness he had shown both her and his son, the humility with which he had finally admitted his fears and his mistakes. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have already begun to see you quite clearly, Adrian Ashworth. Duke or not, steward or not, I see a man who loves his son deeply, however imperfectly he has shown it, and who is finally brave enough to be honest about his own heart." Hope flickered across his face, cautious but unmistakable. "Does that mean there is a chance for us, for all three of us together?" Before Clara could answer, Julian came running across the garden, having noticed the two adults he loved most standing close together with matching hopeful expressions. He threw his arms around Clara's waist, then reached up to grab his father's hand as well, pulling them both toward him with the simple, uncomplicated joy only a child could offer. "Does this mean you are staying?" Julian asked, looking up at Clara with wide, hopeful eyes. "Does this mean we can be a family?" Clara laughed softly, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes as she looked between father and son, both watching her with the exact same hopeful expression. "I suppose," she said, "that it does mean exactly that." In the months that followed, Camden Hall slowly transformed from the cold, quiet house Julian had once described into a home filled with warmth and laughter once more. Clara became a constant, beloved presence in both their lives, her honest kindness continuing to heal wounds that grief and loneliness had left behind for far too long. Adrian, freed finally from the weight of hidden identity and unspoken fear, allowed himself to love openly once more. Both his son and the remarkable woman who had first found that lonely boy crying in a storm, never once suspecting that her simple act of kindness would lead her, eventually, into a family she had never imagined would become her own. Julian grew up knowing, above all else, that he had been found and cherished not for his name or his fortune, but simply for who he was, a lesson his mother would have wanted him to learn, and one that Clara made certain he never forgot. And Clara herself, the village woman who had once comforted a lonely little boy without ever knowing his father was a duke, found in that unlikely meeting not only love, but a family whose warmth would last for the rest of their lives together.